Chapter 14, Personality Assessments. Personality assessments are always a really interesting aspect of assessment to dig into, and one that folks tend to be a little more interested or maybe excited to try out or learn about. So a big piece of this is first figuring out, how do you define a personality? So there's been quite a lot of research and work, and some of these assessments come from that work, in wanting to determine, how do you define a personality and how do you measure a personality? And so as part of that, there are really three different sort of aspects of personality that go into the assessment process. There are traits, which are thought to be pretty consistent patterns of thoughts or feelings or actions that someone would have throughout their life. So if you think about, when you talk about personality traits, the different characteristics of a person that are decently consistent across the lifespan. So regardless of situation or social setting or life circumstance, those traits, those characteristics are generally pretty consistently showing up in the same sort of way or in the same sort of pattern. Then there are states, which are the way that someone would show a trait or a characteristic. And these would be somewhat situational, and they would kind of come and go. So you might have a more anxious state around a certain aspect of your life or a certain chapter of your story, or maybe more angry state, or just different kinds of ways that you would demonstrate those characteristics depending on some sort of external stimulus that's happening and the way that you would react to it based on those traits. So then we have this idea of personality types, which again is something we talk about all the time, but we don't always really define clearly. So this is the idea that you could take these traits or characteristics and you can sort of cluster or group them together into different types of people. And so then the general description of a person would be descriptive of someone who shared similar clusters of those types or characteristics. You might think about this a lot when we hear people talk about like type A personalities or type B personalities that we'll take a look at later in this chapter, but someone who's maybe a more anxious type or a more calm type or a more friendly type of person. So if you think about it in the way that you would describe someone's personality, you would describe some overall characteristics that would maybe fit or be in common with others, but then also some things that are unique to them and the way that they would show them or demonstrate them to others. So the big question is, how do we measure personality? So there are a couple of different methods that are used to develop personality assessments based on the type of theory that you're using. So there's a more rational approach, which is just sort of using deductive logic to figure out how much of a personality trait you have or you don't have. There's more of a theory-based approach, and so these use kind of like those projective tests or pull out unconscious motivations. So we'll take a look at some of these a little later in the chapter with things like the thematic apperception test or the Rorschach inkblot test. There's criterion group approaches, which are really meant to use control groups or norming groups to compare someone's behavior or personality traits to a general group of people to figure out what's unique or different about them, and that's sort of labeled as their personality factors. There's a factor analysis, which really just looks at a whole bunch of variables that someone would have as part of their personality and then see which ones end up being strongest or a better fit. So something like the Neo-PIR, which has different dimensions of personality traits, known as the 5-factor model. This would use a whole bunch of different information that it was gathered to see essentially which factor fits you the best or how much of these factors you have as part of your unique combination of personality traits. And then there are assessments that put all of these things together. So we'll take a look at some examples of all of these in this chapter. So then when we're looking at actual personality inventories, they really fall into one of three categories. There's structured personality inventories, there's projective instruments and techniques, which are a type of assessment like that inkblot test or thematic apperception test, where it's the projection of the individual that puts meaning in the traits to the assessment and not necessarily having like a set list of things to start with. And then personality inventories that have a more positive focus and not necessarily so focused on like aspects of clinical deficiency or maybe even a DSM criteria. So we'll take a look at all three of these categories a little bit more. So looking at structured personality inventories, with these, we are really looking at what kinds of traits does a person have or not have. And that can be looked at in terms of pathology, and if someone has particular traits that would indicate perhaps a DSM diagnosis, or we have more non-pathological focus, which helps to measure if someone has a certain combination of personality traits based on how they answer questions. So the pathology-focused assessments, one of the most common ones, and one we'll dig into a little bit more, is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. And then in terms of non-pathological, we have the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which we already looked at just a bit in the career chapter, and we got to play with a little bit in class. So this is an example of a structured personality inventory whose outcome doesn't necessarily connect to any kind of diagnosis. And then we have the NEO-PIR, which is the Neo Personality Inventory, and there's a revised version now, which is also a pretty commonly used assessment that doesn't focus on criteria for diagnosis. Taking a look at the MMPI, this has been around for quite a while, and it's pretty well validated and held in high regard within therapeutic communities. And its primary purpose is in looking at personality indicators that would lend to diagnostics in terms of DSM-5 criteria. So it's a bit of a more complex tool. It does require just a little bit of training and familiarity with the way that it works. And this is one that we will take a look at in more detail in class together, so we can take a look at a readout and how to look at all of the different scales. But it is a bit unique in that it has some validity scales built into the readout. So the MMPI original version has something like 560 some odd questions. And so it's designed very specifically to have validity questions built in to make sure that it's the most accurate that it can be. And so looking at the validity scales, it's really interesting to see that there are like the F scale, which looks at if you're essentially faking an illness. So if you're infrequently reporting symptoms based on different questions and different aspects of the test, it uses T-score information to determine the validity of your answers in terms of how consistently you're answering questions. Another interesting one is the L scale, which is the lying scale, which kind of does the opposite. So it's meant to determine if someone's trying to paint a better picture than there is or try to hide symptoms of something, then that lie scale would come up with a pretty high score. And then we have the K scale, which is the corrective scale, which is supposed to measure things like denial, lack of self-insight, or maybe even being defensive about the test. So someone might score high on the K scale without even meaning to be dishonest. It just measures how well you know yourself. So beyond these validity scales, there are clinical scales. And these clinical scales would connect with what could become DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. So your book gives you a pretty good breakdown of these different scales, and we'll take a look at them a little bit more in class. But there are ones that kind of a little bit associate with different areas of DSM diagnoses that you would take a look at. They used to kind of connect more with the 5-axis scale from the DSM-4, and so now to the DSM-5, we don't have that classification system anymore, but you can still see the connections with certain anxiety related disorders, or things like schizophrenia, hallucinations, psychotic disorders, all of those kinds of things. So someone would get an output score for each one of these scales, and then there's what's known as kind of a normal level and a clinical level. And so if you fall into the clinical level with any of these scales, then that tells the clinician that they need to do some further diagnostic work to see what might be going on. So in 2020, they just came out with the MMPI-3. It just came out this fall, actually, pretty recently. And so these new scales expanded these clinical options. So it includes things like eating disorder concerns, compulsivity, some things that would connect to ADHD diagnoses like being impulsive, and a self-importance scale that might connect to some personality disorders like narcissism or borderline personality disorder. Another huge update is that now there is an officially validated Spanish version of this assessment. So up until this year, it was only available in English. And so it's a pretty huge development that they now have on translation in Spanish. And they actually have norming groups that took the Spanish version so that they know that the norming for the Spanish equivalent is about the same as the English. And then there was a huge update in terms of a more diverse norming group. So the test developers tried to recruit norming groups that mirrored the US Census data in terms of diversity breakdowns in the United States. And so they have about 1,600 new individuals who have taken this assessment to add reliability and validity and hopefully provide a little bit more cultural competency in terms of representation in the norming group for this assessment. So on our course page, we have the old MMPI-2 and the new MMPI-3 information for you to take a look at. And as I said, we'll take a look at this a little bit in class 2. The next structured personality inventory is the NCMI. This inventory is similar to an MMPI, but it's often considered to be an alternative. So this one is a bit shorter in terms of how many questions that it has, and it is more focused on indicators of personality disorders that would align with the DSM-5 criteria. So the MMPI has a broader focus of clinical disorders, and the MCMI is more focused on personality disorders. So some use them together, but often MCMI can be used as an alternative to the MMPI if you'd like something shorter or perhaps a bit more focused for your client. So again, you'll see the scales roughly associate with diagnoses. So you see narcissistic or histrionic or schizoid, which would associate with personality disorders. There's a scale for borderline, and then what used to be called Axis 1 disorders, which relate to more clinical diagnoses, so anxiety, substance use, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then it also has some validity scales. It's not as extensive as the MMPI, but it does offer some indicators of changing your scores or being inconsistent in your scores as part of your outcome report as well. Another pretty well-known personality assessment is the NEO Personality Inventory, or the NEO-PI, and there's a revised version, so it's known as the NEO-PI-R. This is built from the 5-factor model of personality, and so it breaks aspects or traits of a person down into some different dimensions, and you sort of scale. You would score higher or lower on certain scales, almost similar to like an MBTI type of model where you would have more extroversion or introversion. Same sort of idea here with determining how well or how much you have of different factors that would connect with the traits of your personality, or facets, as this assessment would call those characteristics. So we have neuroticism, which is how much you tend to experience negative emotion, or kind of how emotionally reactive you are. So this is someone who would score high on this scale, would have a lot of anxiety or anger or hostility, be very self-conscious, be very nervous, be very impulsive. Someone with extroversion, sort of similar to in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, so sort of how you get energy, and that would be connected with being social and connected to others, and enjoying activity that connects you with others. Then there's openness to experience, which is just like it sounds, so how open you are to new ideas and new experiences. Some of this connects to things like how creative you are, how outwardly you're willing to feel emotions, how open you are to new experiences, ideas, and values. Then there's agreeableness. So this is kind of how friendly, considerate, how trustworthy you are, how willing you are to trust others, how much you want to help others, so the sense of altruism, or empathy for others, and then sort of how well you get along with other folks as opposed to creating conflict. And then there's conscientiousness, which is your sense of social responsibility and your ability to combat adversity. So discipline and being deliberate and being able to overcome obstacles. So you would rate higher or lower on these 5 different scales on this assessment, and it would tell you how much you have of these different traits in your combination of your personality. And then if you'd like something incredibly detailed and broad to look at personality traits, you can use the 16PF. So this is a much more extensive assessment. It's the same idea as like a Myers-Briggs or a NEO-PIR. It's just a lot broader. And so it looks at 16 different personality factors and gives you what's called a STEN score to show you how much of each of these factors you have in your unique combination of who you are. So there are personality factors that are unique to each person, and then it also rates you on 5 global factors that sort of connect with the same idea as the 5-factor model of personality. It just doesn't as closely tie to that model as the NEO-PIR does. So as you can see here, there are a whole lot of different factors that it assesses in terms of like warmth and liveliness and sensitivity and vigilance and tension. And your textbook gives you an example of what a readout would look like in terms of how you would rate on your STEN score and how it would show the different ends of each scale for these personality factors, and then the same for those 5 global factors. A bit of a different option in terms of personality assessment is a projective assessment. So we have the Rorschach and the TAT, which we'll take a look at here in just a moment. But then we also have some verbal projective options, which would just involve asking some kinds of questions. Some of these connect a little bit to counseling theory that we've learned about in a previous class, but things like, if you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? Or if you had a magic wand and you could change things about your life, what would you change? Or things that almost feel like free association or more Freudian techniques, like the Rotter incomplete sentences. So you would start the sentence and have the client finish. So things like, I like, I don't like, what things annoy me. And then you would have the client either fill in those phrases or fill in a story about what happens next, and you would draw some conclusions about personality from that. And then we have drawing focused, and we'll play with this a little bit in class, but drawings, projective drawings are an option to have kids or adults sort of give a visual of what kinds of things are going on and what that tells you about their personality. So you're drawing meaning from different things that they would draw. Some of the more well-known ones are the house, tree, person assessment that you would use with children, and it's as simple as asking them to draw a house, a tree, and a person, and then looking at what kinds of characteristics there are in the drawing that they made. And there are some particular interpretation guides that kind of help you with what sort of things to be looking for. You might also ask someone to draw a picture of their family. So draw a picture of your family with everyone in it, including you. And then you would take a look at how they drew their family in relation to each other, how they drew themselves in connection to others, if they're standing next to their family, or if they're completely separated, or if they're bigger than their family or smaller than their family in the drawing. These would be the kinds of things that we would look at and then see what conclusions we could draw about their personalities from that information. So this is an example of one of the cards that would be used in the Rorschach ink blot test. So no one really knows what some people know what the real cards look like, because if you're a clinician, you can purchase the cards to use as an assessment, but it's not something that's really readily available out on the internet. So they try to really keep the actual ink blots really private as copyrighted material only for those who are using them. And that's partially because of that's how they show validity in this instrument. So if everyone has seen the ink blots before on the internet, then you're not going to get their honest reaction to what they think they look like. And so the purpose of this test, it comes with cards, And there are 10 cards, and each one is an inkblot, and they're all symmetrical drawings. So they're the same from right to left. They're all 5 are black and white, 5 have color to them. I've actually never seen the color version of these cards because I don't have a copy of them. So usually you just see the black and white versions of them presented in kind of popular media things. So you would show your client each card individually and give them a chance to describe what they see in the inkblots, and then you would have to record what they say word for word and ask what prompted their response. And then from that, you interpret the outcomes to see what you can determine about their personality. So I challenge you to pause this video and take a minute and take a look at this inkblot and challenge yourself to see what you see in it. Then similarly, you have the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. It's the same sort of idea. It's that projective assessment like the Rorschach. So there's a series of cards, and on those cards are black and white pictures of some sort of scene. So this is an example, and again, the actual cards are copyrighted material, so they try pretty hard to keep them secret so that you haven't seen them all over the internet before you take the actual test. So it goes a little bit further than the Rorschach. So this test asks whoever's taking it to come up with the story of what's happening. And so after you look at the card, you would then tell the therapist or the assessor the story about the picture and what had happened leading up to what's happening, what would happen in the moment, what the people in there might be thinking and feeling, and then what would happen next. And so in that, they're telling the story of the picture, and you're asking questions about who they are and what are they feeling and how's this going to turn out. And then there's a guide for interpreting what somebody sees in the story that they make up according to the card. And with these projective tests, it's really hard to have reliable and valid information. And these are more qualitatively focused tests as opposed to quantitatively focused tests. So if you remember actually your research class, quantitative research focuses on statistics and numbers. So you put things into a computer or a system, you do statistics, you get an output. These are more qualitative assessments. So somebody is giving you a verbal response, and then you're drawing meaning from it to help tell you things about their personality. So whenever you're using something that's more qualitative in nature, reliability and validity is just not assessed in the same sort of way. And so we can't necessarily say that the reliability and validity of these types of perception tests or projection tests are the same as like an MMPI-3, but they're scored and measured very differently too. So again, as you'll hear me say a lot in this class, it really just comes down to using something in the way that it's intended and drawing the types of conclusions that are intended by the people who have developed the assessment. So again, I encourage you to pause the video here, take a look at this scene, and see if you can make up the story of what happened prior to this, what people might be thinking and feeling, what's going on in this picture now, and what might be happening next, and see what you come up with. So finally, we do have some assessments that are more positive focused. So these are not necessarily focused on like clinical issues or making a diagnosis, but more from positive psychology and a strengths focused kind of place. A prime example of that is the ProQual, the quality of life scale that's posted in our course for you to be able to use for your assignment in providing an assessment to someone. And so in all of these assessments, when we're looking at personality, it's important to think about reliability and validity of the instruments, but also how the human factor can impact the reliability and validity of personality assessments. So considering why you're using these kinds of assessments, and if it's for like a court mandated assessment, or if it's like you're doing part of an ASI process or something like that, it's just important to think about these factors in relation to the responses that a client would give. So obviously we have to think about social desirability. So everybody wants to present themselves in the best light possible, even if it's not accurate. The client might have a tendency to accept or agree with everything So saying yes or true to every single thing on the personality assessment to try to manipulate it to come out a certain way or to appear more desirable. Similarly, things that are not acquiescent, so putting no for everything because you're resistant to the process, or again, you want to try to manipulate the outcome of the personality assessment. Looking at unusual or uncommon responses, so that deviance from what would be typical, and that would take away from our ability to identify some of those traits that an individual might have. Again, choosing things that are extreme as opposed to things that are more in the middle. So if it's on a scale of 1 to 5, picking all 1s and all 5s and nothing in the middle to try to impact the outcome, and then sort of guessing when you don't really have the self-awareness or are not willing to kind of introspect enough to kind of determine what the answer is for you. So some of the assessments that we've talked about do have validity scales built in that are going to sort of protect against some of these things, but then there are a lot of assessments where that's not built in. And so it's just something to be aware of, that personality assessments are often based on a self-report, which means that we have to think about these factors in terms of how people are responding, and we might have to implement those things into a scoring report if, like, in an MMPI or something, we find out that the validity scales indicate that the outcomes are not necessarily very accurate, then that's something that we have to report in our interpretation of the assessment.